He believes this is not the only case where he has been betrayed by the West, or Russia has been betrayed by the West. And one of the reasons it's going to be extremely difficult to get a diplomatic deal to shut down the Ukraine war is that Putin doesn't trust the West. And when you hear Donald Trump saying that he's going to shut it down before he moves into the White House or immediately after he moves into the White House, Trump is operating on the assumption that Putin is going to trust him. I can guarantee you Putin is not going to trust Trump any more than he would trust Kamala Harris or Joe Biden.
Are you sure about that? Because
Yes.
Trump is a different figure in this whole theater of foreign policy. He is an anti-establishment figure, as we just discussed before, and he doesn't have the same blob around him.
No.
So you wouldn't agree with that?
No, but remember what we said. Between 2017 and 2021, Trump went head-to-head with the blob on the Russia-Ukraine issue, and Trump lost.
Yeah, but he went head-to-head, and I think that's a different position than the other presidential candidates or the other people would have.
But he lost.
Okay.
So you're assuming that when he gets if he gets reelected.
I assume he does get
Yeah,
elected.
let's assume he gets
Yeah.
elected, right? That this time he could beat the blob back. And I do not believe he can do that. And the reason is I think that Putin is going to drive such a hard deal. Let me just say a quick word on that, because this is very important. Putin has said just to have negotiations to end the war, the West and Ukraine have to accept two facts of life. One is that those 4 oblasts that we have now annexed, plus Crimea, are Russia's forever. The West has to accept that. And number 2, the West and Ukraine have to say categorically that Ukraine will never be in NATO and it will be a neutral state. This is just to have negotiations.
And this is unacceptable for the West.
Yes, it's clearly unacceptable for the West, but given our conversation, the question is it acceptable for when Trump had his famous debate with Joe Biden that finished Joe Biden off, right? Trump was explicitly asked the question whether he would accept those 2 terms. He said no. Well, if he doesn't accept those 2 terms, you can't even get negotiations started, right? And if he does say he accepts those 2 terms, neutral NATO plus recognition forever of Russian absorption of those 4 oblasts, the blob will go after him hammer and tongue. And then we'll see what happens. And if I had to bet on who wins when it's the blob against Trump, my money's on the blob.
Mm-hmm, because it's been winning, let's say, the past decade.
It's very big. It's very powerful,
Yeah.
deep-seated ideology, and as you say, it's been on a winning streak for a long time. The other thing is that Trump is not a careful and calculating politician. He's not a real Machiavelli, and that's why he's ultimately not that dangerous. Again, I'm not a Trump supporter, as I made clear. I'm not voting for him, but he's not a sophisticated president. He's not somebody like Lyndon Johnson, who was really dangerous because he knew how to make the machinery work. Trump he's careless, right? He's not somebody, who I think could go up against the blob and beat the blob. But we'll see. I may be wrong.
This is interesting, the way you laid out Ukraine and how it could play out, because I do have the idea that a lot of Europeans, or Germans in particular, look at the elections in the United States and are kind of hoping for Trump because they believe that he would shut down Ukraine, and because he has shown that he's more of a peace president than Biden and the establishment around Biden, right? So what would you say is this fear of a certain World War III that some Germans are very afraid of? Because, there were discussions about a general draft in Germany, bringing it back, and people get a little antsy. So what is going on here? Then we have our defense minister talking about becoming kriegstüchtig, which means to be more war ready, right? And this is something that Germans are very sensitive to. So what would you say to Germans, or maybe Europeans more in general, who are afraid that things could escalate to a World War III when we're looking at these 3 areas in the world, right? Southeast Asia, Israel, and Ukraine, which is the closest to Germany?
Well, let me say just at a very general level, that I think that it's unlikely that we'll have anything approximating World War III. But it's not impossible. And one can hypothesize all sorts of plausible scenarios where you get a major war between, let's say, NATO and Russia, or China and the United States. But let me just unpack what's going on in Europe and tell you how I see things. First of all, I think the most likely scenario by far where the Russians use nuclear weapons is where they're losing. And in 2022, when the Ukrainians were doing very well and the Russians were surrendering territory in Ukraine, I think that was a very dangerous time. Because if the Russians were to lose in Ukraine, I believe they would use nuclear weapons.
And let me just add to, at this point, we talked about this in the interview that we did 2.5 years ago, and I'm going to link it somewhere up here, but continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that was the scenario to worry about, because the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. Many people in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians view this as an existential threat, or NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. But you want to understand, the Russians think it's an existential threat, and it's what they think that matters. So they think it's an existential threat. If they're losing in Ukraine, that's when we really have to be worried about nuclear use and the possibility of escalation up the nuclear ladder. But that's not happening. Russia's going to win the war. Okay. And in fact, I don't think Trump or Harris will be the principal driving force behind ending this war. It will be events on the battlefield.
Oh, can you quickly, just a quick question in between. What does it mean when you say Russia's going to win the war? What's that going to look like?
They're going to end up conquering a large slice of territory in eastern Ukraine.
And is Ukraine just going to, what's it called, capitulate? Like, are they just going to wave the white flag and say we're done now?
Yeah, I think that that's going to happen at some point in a not too distant future. To put it in slightly different terms, so I'm perfectly clear, I think the fighting or the shooting is going to stop. Okay. But what's going to happen, in my opinion, is you're going to get a frozen conflict. This is a very important point to understand. I do not think you're going to get a negotiated settlement. You're not going to get a peace agreement, right? Because the Ukrainians in the West will never accept Russian annexation of territory inside of eastern Ukraine, and they will continue to flirt with the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that means you can't work out a deal. Remember the conditions that Putin has stipulated for getting a peace agreement, right? We're not going to accept those conditions. You're not going to get a peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. And you want to understand, once that frozen conflict sets in, the West, mainly the United States, but the West, and this will include the Germans, and Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine and to undermine Russia itself. The Russians, for their part, are going to go to great lengths to cause trouble in Europe for as far as the eye can see, and the Russians are going to go to great lengths to poison transatlantic relations. So you're going to have this nasty competition between Russia on one side, Ukraine and the West on the other side.
But not necessarily on the battlefield. You're talking about like disinformation, propaganda efforts, and so on.
Yeah, it'll be a frozen conflict. But what you want to remember is that there are a number of potential flash where that frozen conflict can turn into a hot conflict. And I'll give them to you quickly, and we can talk about any one of them in more detail if you want. The Arctic, the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad, Belarus. Lukashenko steps down. You can rest assured the United States will try to foster a color revolution in Belarus. You think that's going to go over well with the Russians? I would not bet a lot of money on that. Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea.
Do you really think that the foreign policy establishment is planning to do something like that after the shit show in Ukraine?
It's in America's DNA at this point, right? We think, and you Europeans have basically drunk the Kool-Aid and bought onto this whole enterprise. You think we have a right, a responsibility, and the power to run around the world, overthrowing governments and promoting democracy. I'm not saying you do, but Most Europeans do. Most elites
Well,
do.
the elite does.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
people,
right.
not so much. But okay.
The German blob.
The German blob, yeah. Or part of the German blob, at least. Because things are changing. And I think with a new generation of politicians, you could see a change because we've seen it in the past. So something like that could happen again.
Let's hope.
But what you were talking about before was that you do not think there was a real scenario of World War III happening, which is actually kind of nice to hear from you.
Yeah, so. I think it's highly unlikely that will happen in Europe. I think I want to be very clear here. I think you're going to have poisonous relations, right, between Russia on one side and Ukraine
for the next couple of decades, right?
For the next couple of decades.
So like another Cold War.
Yeah.
Without a wall.
Yeah, I find it hard to imagine. I hope that I'm wrong, that things can be improved. And I want to emphasize again, there are all these potential flashpoints. You want to remember the ice is melting in the Arctic, and that has all sorts of geopolitical consequences. And now that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, 7 of the 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic are NATO countries. And of course, the odd country out is Russia. The Russians, who wanted to keep the Chinese out of the Arctic, have now brought the Chinese with them into the Arctic. The Chinese are piggybacking on the Russians in the Arctic. Why is this the case? It is the case because the Russians are outnumbered 7-1.
They were forced, but by their own action, because they attacked Ukraine, right?
There's no question.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. There's no question about that. But I just want to be clear here. I believe, as I said before, the decision in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO was a catastrophic decision, right? It was remarkably foolish. I believe Angela Merkel understood this. Again, that's my point. To think that she understood that Putin would see this as a declaration of war, which of course is what caused him to invade Ukraine. It was the principal reason. I understand that most people in the West, especially in a country like Germany, don't accept that argument. But the evidence, in my humble opinion, is overwhelming that that's why he invaded Ukraine. But once he invaded Ukraine, putting this to an end, ending this conflict, and going back to having some sort of peaceful arrangement in Europe is almost impossible. It was an unbelievably foolish move.